First of all, we have 2,159 cases of coronavirus in Victoria. That's 64 more than yesterday. 13 attributable to outbreaks, 20 the product of routine testing, 31 that are still being investigated. We have done more than 809,000 tests since January the 1st, and yesterday's test numbers were in the order of 17,416 tests. I want to take you firstly through a bit of an update on the suburban testing blitz. As you know, that ran for 3 days. We still have a number of tests that are in the laboratory being processed. We'll get those in coming days and we'll report to you as we do. But since last Thursday, across the state, and with a particular focus on those hotspots that are well known to all of you, there have been 93,000 plus tests that have been conducted. 37,000 doors have been knocked on, particularly in those hotspot suburbs. There are, as I said, thousands of tests that are still being processed, but from those that have been processed, and again I want to thank all of those lab technicians for the work they're doing. I want to thank all the teams of people out door knocking, and I particularly want to thank people in those communities that have opened the door and have had a conversation and have agreed to be tested. It is only through their vigilance and their partnership in this effort that we can get to this point. The suburban testing blitz was always about determining how big a problem we had, tracking it, tracing it, and then giving us the data that we needed to be able to take these next steps. Not steps that are taken lightly, but steps that are absolutely critical if we are to contain this and get back to a point where we can suppress and control the amount of virus in the Victorian community. There have been some 233 new cases of coronavirus since last Thursday, since that testing blitz began. That is an unacceptably high number and one that poses a real threat to all of us, not just in those hotspot suburbs, but indeed in every suburb and ultimately every community across our state. The suburbs with the highest number of new cases are Broadmeadows, Fawkner and Albanvale, and of most concern is the number of community transmission cases in those suburbs and other suburbs proximate to them. I'll come back to that list of suburbs and the criteria that we've chosen for these next steps in just a moment. I do feel obliged to point out, just as I've thanked those who have participated, and we are deeply grateful for all of our staff. It's literally an army of people out there doing this work. We also thank all of those who have willingly and fulsomely engaged in this public health exercise. But I do feel obliged to inform you that in Broadmeadows and Keilor Downs alone, some 928 people refused to be tested. Now, I can't change that. That's happened. All I can do is encourage those people, come forward and get tested today, come forward and get tested tomorrow. And in a broader sense, if someone comes to your doorstep and asks you to be tested, please say yes. Please get tested. Even if people don't knock on your door, if you have symptoms, please come forward and get tested. It's a simple process. It's a quick process. It is a massive contribution to tracking and tracing, to locking this virus down, to taking control of this virus and making sure that we can, at an appropriate point in the future, resume our opening up, resume that process of easing in a safe and balanced way. Please get tested if you are asked to be tested. Now, because of the unacceptably high rates of community transmission and the unacceptably high rates of new cases, even those where we can attribute their source, it is incredibly important that we take some next steps to deal with this challenge right now. We know that suburban lockdowns, stay-at-home orders, are a series of restrictions that work. We have all been through that journey, we've all been through that process, and we know that at the end of that process we were then able to begin the process of opening up. I'll come back to behaviour, I'll come back to obligations on all of us, but in the first instance the Chief Health Officer has advised me to reimpose restrictions in line with stage 3, so they will be stay-at-home orders except for 4 reasons to leave your home. I'll go through all of this in some detail. I think it's appropriate for those who are watching. These orders will be effective from 11:59 p.m. tomorrow night, and they will run for 4 weeks until the 29th of July. There will only be 4 reasons that you are permitted to leave your house, and only if you really have to: for work or school, for care or caregiving, for daily exercise, for food and other essentials. They are the acceptable reasons to leave, but only if you need to. It is not an opportunity to go shoe shopping. It is not an opportunity to be taking daily exercise for the whole day, and particularly not outside the suburbs I'm about to list, which will be the subject of these orders. I'll come back in a moment to what this means for businesses within these postcodes, and I'll come back also to the obligations on everybody outside of these postcodes in terms of travelling in and out of these zones. Now, I'll do this slowly because obviously there's a translation issue, and I just want everyone to be able to follow the list of postcodes I'm about to read out. So the following postcodes from 11:59 p.m. tomorrow night will be the subject to the stay-at-home order, with only 4 permitted reasons to leave your home. 3012, which is Brooklyn, Kingsville, Maidstone, Tottenham, West Footscray. 3021 being Auburn Vale, Kealba, Kings Park, St Albans. 3032 Ascot Vale, High Point City, Maribyrnong, Travancore. 3038 Keilor Downs, Keilor Lodge, Taylor's Lakes, Water Gardens. 3042 Airport West, Keilor Park, Nidri. 3046 Glenroy, Hadfield, Oak Park. 3047 Broadmeadows, Dallas, Jacana. 3055 Brunswick South, Brunswick West, Mooney Vale, Moreland West. 3060 Faulkner. 3064 Craigieburn, Donnybrook, Mickleham, Roxburgh Park and Calcallo. Just to read through the postcodes one more time, I won't go through all the suburbs within those postcodes. I think Victorians know which postcode they're in. 3012, 3021, 3032, 3038, 3042, 3046, 3047, 3055, 3060 and 3064. That means each and every home within those postcodes from 11:59 p.m. tomorrow night will have to stay in their homes, except for those 4 reasons. And again, I stress, only when you need to use one of those 4 reasons, only when you need to. This only works if people comply. This only works if people use common sense, and I'm confident that those communities will do that. Now, I'll go to enforcement in a moment, but just before then, in terms of the obligations on the rest of our state, as it relates to movement in and out of these 10 postcodes. Now, there will be a number of people who work in those postcodes. There will be a number of people who, for the purposes of, say, caregiving, might need to enter those postcodes. The 4 reasons that apply to the people living in those postcodes, for them, the 4 permitted reasons why they can leave their home, those 4 reasons also apply to the rest of us who don't live in those postcodes. You shouldn't be going into those postcodes over the next 4 weeks unless it is for work, and only work that you have to do in person. You shouldn't be going into those postcodes unless it was, for instance, to get care or to give care. I think people follow that logic. The 4 reasons travel with all of us as it relates to these postcodes. We have to limit the number of people who are going in and out of these postcodes, and sadly, we have to ensure that residents, families within these postcodes do not leave their home other than for those 4 permitted reasons, and again, only when they need to. On enforcement, Victoria Police will be actively enforcing these suburban lockdowns, this stay-at-home order. They will be patrolling throughout these communities, and if people are out of their home, then they will be politely asked, why are you out of your home? And if you are out of your home for anything other than a permitted reason, then financial penalties apply, on-the-spot fines apply. I do sincerely hope that it doesn't come to that, but this needs to be taken seriously. It needs to be dealt with appropriately. I can also inform you that it won't necessarily be every access point to these suburbs, because there are literally hundreds of them, but certainly across many, and it will revolve and rotate. Many of the main transport corridors in and out of these suburbs will be the subject of booze bus type checks. So not necessarily every vehicle, but vehicles will be stopped randomly, but in an organised and coordinated way. And people moving in and out of the suburb will be asked to identify themselves, to identify their address, and to provide good reason for them being out and about. These are extraordinary steps. These are not things that we've had to do in the past, but such is the nature of this virus. It is so wildly infectious that if we don't take these steps now, we will finish up in a situation of, rather than locking down 10 postcodes, we will be locking down every postcode. I don't want to get to that point. We need to avoid that. And these are, in the judgment of the public health team and on the advice of the Chief Health Officer, these are the appropriate steps to take. As it relates to holidays, we know school holidays are on at the moment. If you are a resident in these postcodes and you are already on holiday, you can complete your holiday. I think it impractical to be asking people to return home, but if you have not yet, that is between now and midnight tomorrow night, if you are not on holiday, then you will be prevented from going on holiday. That is not one of the 4 reasons that you are permitted to leave your home for. Now, that will give rise to a number of bookings that will be cancelled, and there will be an impost on tourism businesses. The Minister for Tourism and Industry Support will speak to those issues and some support that we will provide to those businesses tomorrow. On the broader issue of businesses that, because of this order and these restrictions, will need to go back to settings that we became all too familiar with some time ago, cafes, restaurants, hotels being takeaway only, gyms, for instance, being closed. We'll get you a full list. I think you may already have that, but people are well acquainted with the nature of those restrictions. They will again have to go to those settings, either takeaway only or close. We know that that's going to be painful. We know that that's going to be a really significant challenge. So I can announce today, and the Minister for Industry Support will add to this announcement tomorrow with some further detail, but there will be, for each and every business that has to close because of these new rules in those 10 postcodes, there will be an urgent grant of $5,000. That adds to the $10,000 that the vast majority of these businesses have already accessed under our business support program. This is a series of rules for 4 weeks. Again, we will review them periodically. Their status will be based on data. It'll be based on case numbers, and so too will our support for businesses. If we need to go further, then of course we stand ready to do that. But I wanted to be very clear with people. We know that from midnight tomorrow night, this will cause significant disruption for families, significant pain for businesses, and we will step in immediately to essentially take that grant of $10,000 that's already been paid to exactly those sorts of businesses up to another $5,000. Again, that's an initial response. If there is more that we need to do, then of course we will do that. I now want to turn to another issue, and that is, of course, the question that so many people have naturally asked and been, including ourselves, why does Victoria find itself, why do these 10 suburbs, and to a certain extent all of us, because we all have to follow the rules, we all have to do the right thing and help in this important response, lest it becomes a series of settings that have to be applied across the whole state. Why are these circumstances confronting us? Now, when we have spikes in cases, when we have outbreaks, when we have community transmission, we literally leave no stone unturned to try and answer the riddle, to try and answer the questions that this virus throws up to us each and every day. An important tool in providing those answers is what's called genomic sequencing. That gives us greater levels of detail, a finer level of detail about chains of transmission of this virus, linkages that are not always apparent through contact tracing, through talking to people, but linkages that science provides to us about how a person has contracted the virus and links between different cases. This morning I received the most comprehensive genomics briefing that I have received throughout the pandemic, and what that briefing provided and put to me very clearly is that at least a significant number, and potentially more, of the outbreaks in the north of the city are attributable via genomic sequencing to staff members in hotel quarantine breaching well-known and well-understood infection control protocols. That is unacceptable to me. I'm sure that will be unacceptable certainly to all of those who will be impacted by the restrictions that we have had to reimpose, announced today, coming into force at 11:59 p.m. tomorrow night. Accordingly, I've done two things. One, I want to announce to you that we will have a former judge conduct an inquiry into those infection control protocol breaches and any other issues in relation to hotel quarantine. I hasten to add this sequencing relates to outbreaks and chains of transmission from some time ago. There is a time lag in getting this DNA work, this sequencing done. More recent outbreaks that can in any way be attributable to hotel quarantine, I think, are a separate issue. The point I want to make is that the clear issues that this raises are from some weeks ago, in fact perhaps even longer than that, and my advice is that there have been changes, any issues have been remedied since, but for the abundance of caution, the second thing that I have done is inform the Prime Minister that I would like him to divert all flights away from Melbourne for the next 2 weeks. I'll have conversations with other state leaders to explain that and to thank them in advance of the extra load that they will carry. That is for the abundance of caution. Plus, I would also make the point that just as we are having to focus exclusively on tracking and tracing these spikes in numbers and the enforcement of the stay-at-home stage 3 in effect restrictions we've imposed on those 10 postcodes, we need to have all of our focus on that. The former judge, that's being finalised. I'll make further announcements about terms of reference and the person involved. As I said before, when we have a spike in cases, in fact with every case, we leave no stone unturned. That's the appropriate way it should be. The sequencing report came to me first thing this morning. It is the most comprehensive genomic sequencing report that I have received throughout the pandemic, and on that basis I've taken this action. This is deeply frustrating, this is unacceptable, and we will have that judicial inquiry to get to the bottom of exactly what has occurred. I would make the point that it's one thing to have an infection control breakdown in any setting, but then if people then go and gather in large numbers, this has been a family-to-family issue, the individual families involved and their social circles. It does make a broader point as well, and let me perhaps conclude on this before we go to questions. We are all in this together, and this is going to be deeply disruptive for those 10 postcodes. This is going to be deeply painful and damaging for those businesses involved. This is the public health advice. This is what we must do now. If we do not do this now, then I won't be locking down 10 postcodes, I will be locking down all postcodes. And I can't do this, the government cannot do this on our own. We need every Victorian to play their part, and I ask respectfully, I'm trying to be as clear, as direct, as sincere as I possibly can be. We cannot do this on our own. We need every Victorian family to follow the rules. We need every Victorian family, particularly those in these lockdown postcodes, to know and understand that whilst this is deeply inconvenient for you, you are making a massive contribution for the whole state and indeed the whole nation. If you are sick, you cannot go out. The only thing you should be doing if you are sick is getting tested. Please, on behalf of every Victorian family, if you or a family member get a knock on the door and the offer of a test, please say yes. Please get the test, because the results, the data, the information, the certainty that we get from those tests is in many respects the most powerful tool that we have. If we all follow the rules, if we all stick together, if we, as we will, provide any and all support to every one of those families and every one of those businesses that are being locked down, we will get to the point where we stabilise, where we see falling case numbers, and then there will be a time where we'll be able to lift those important stage 3 restrictions, that stay-at-home order, and then begin the important process of opening up again. That is a process that we remain committed to. We have had to delay the next steps in that process. That's simply because the best public health advice tells us that that's just far too risky and could contribute to the challenge that we face now. Essentially, no public health official, not even thousands of them, no government, not even its leadership and thousands of public servants can beat this virus on our own. We all have to work together, and I ask every Victorian family to work with me and my team to follow the rules, to stay at home if you're sick, to get tested if you're sick. And if someone comes and knocks on your door and offers you a test on your doorstep, please make sure the answer is yes. That's such a powerful thing. Just finally, I have asked the Prime Minister for some additional support, so just in terms of confirming arrangements, and I'm very, very grateful to be receiving support in both laboratory capacity as well as staff and others who are supporting us from lots of different states. I thank each of them, and I've taken the opportunity to thank them on behalf of Victorians personally. But I just wanted to confirm for you, I have asked for 3 things from the Commonwealth Government, and the Commonwealth Government have agreed. 100 team leaders to help with the massive coordination effort of our suburban testing blitz, which will continue for weeks and months to come. 200 clinical staff to help free up other clinical staff that are running, for instance, some of our mass testing sites, so that they can move from, say, the Melbourne showgrounds to doing more doorstep testing, so door-to-door testing. And thirdly, 500 Commonwealth public servants, principally those based in Melbourne, to help with our community engagement strategy, so door knocking, all of those type of activities. I thank the Prime Minister and his government for agreeing to those requests, and of course I've also asked him around the diversion of flights for these next 2 weeks. I think that is all that I needed to announce and go through. I might now throw it over to you for questions.
What happens to schools in these hot zones?
Schools, on the advice of the Chief Health Officer, we're seeing no real evidence of transmission between kids and adults. We're seeing no real evidence that school attendance is a big driver of the spike in cases, and on that basis, and again I do hasten to add, we are on day 2 of the school holidays. This could change. If it did change, we would give parents as much notice as we possibly could. But the advice to me from Brett and his team is that we won't need to go back to remote learning for these postcodes. We will be able to continue face-to-face learning. And I know that may seem counterintuitive, but the advice and the detailed analysis is that we're not seeing significant transmission between kids and adults, or significant transmission out of school communities might be the better way to go. But there are some other steps that we may take in relation to temperature checking, things of that nature, and we'll make further announcements about that. It's hard to, when making these sorts of decisions, to find the upside, but the fact that we are on school holidays perhaps makes that task just a little bit easier.
Premier, of those 800, there's no ADF presence, and in the hotels as well, there's been no ADF presence. Why is it that you don't want the ADF?
It's not. There's no issue about wanting or not wanting the ADF. They do a fantastic job, and where they are most appropriately deployed, that's exactly what happens. There will be ADF in the numbers that I read out. I just want to be... there is some further work to be done. The 200 clinical staff may well come from the Australian Defence Force. I think that there is a, out of respect for the fact that it's not easy to assemble 200 people from the ADF, I wasn't going to attribute them to the ADF. I think they will finish up being ADF staff or ADF members, but they may be others as well. There may be other nurses and doctors as well as ADF personnel. Not all 200 may necessarily come from the Australian Defence Force, but again, wherever we have needed the Australian Defence Force, we have sought them, and I'm very, very pleased to say that the Prime Minister and his ministers have always said yes. And that's not just for coronavirus, that goes right back to the bushfires, and in many respects the challenge we face now is very much a public health bushfire.
Would you envisage using the ADF to police these suburb borders?
I don't, and again, I'm not interested in getting into a debate about requests and denials. That's just not the way this relationship works. If I need something from the Prime Minister, I ring him, I speak to him personally, or he rings me, and we work out what needs to happen, and the requests get processed from then. We don't do the paperwork together, that's done by others. I spoke with him multiple times last night and had a series of texts back and forth to make sure that we were really clear on what we needed. So I just wouldn't want anyone to form the view that there's any difference in approach or opinion between the Prime Minister and I when it comes to doing whatever it takes to tackle this virus. The moment I get advice that we need additional help, whether that be public servants, Australian Federal Police, Border Force, the ADF, you name it, I'll be on the phone to the Prime Minister, and that'll be a respectful conversation. And I think, on form, you'd have to say the answer would most likely be yes. Every time I've needed it, the answer's always been yes. So I'm just making a broader point about any sense that there's anything other than complete unity when it comes to these matters between the Prime Minister and I, and might I say as well, complete unity at a national cabinet level. On the issue of ADF out on the streets, the advice I have is that Victoria Police are very confident that they will be able to do what they have powers for. ADF would not have those powers, for instance. They're not members of Victorian law enforcement. And I just make the point to every Victorian, I don't want to have to stand at this podium and report that hundreds and hundreds of people have received fines, and there's no need for me to have to do that. If people do the right thing, if they follow the rules, I know it's inconvenient, I know it's challenging. If, based on your family circumstances, you need further support, we will get that support to you. There's no need to break the rules. If you have hardship, we will support you. But Victoria Police will not be mucking about. They will be there policing these rules. They will be there in booze bus type arrangements on major corridors in and out of these postcodes. And if people make a judgment that they can ignore the rules and there's a low chance of getting caught, I think that would be a very unwise judgment to make. I think that Victoria Police will catch you, but I really hope it doesn't come to that. I genuinely hope it does not come to that.
Are there still security guards operating now in case of...
There are some, and there are Corrections Victoria staff as well as health staff that are in there as well, and I can also confirm for you that provided, I haven't got the answer from the Commonwealth yet, but I'm pretty sure the answer will be yes, there'll be no further flights arriving. Today's flights will have been the last ones for a period of 2 weeks.
Can people expect to be stopped by police at train stations or the like to be asked why they're out on top?
I think that there will be, I'll leave the detail of enforcement to Victoria Police, but I think logic tells you that yes, there will be in places of large gathering in and around those areas. There will be at transport hubs, there will be police, not asking every single person, but certainly asking people randomly and frequently why they're out, where they live. We don't want this to be any more onerous, we don't want this to be any more challenging than it is, but ultimately we can't have a situation where these rules are not enforced, because if they're not enforced they won't be followed, by some at least. Many will follow these rules and will not need to come in contact with any member of law enforcement or any member of our public health team. Others, however, experience tells you, may want to find loopholes and gaps and may want to try their luck. I don't think it would be a smart move to break these rules, for both for your family, for every family, and for your wallet, because I think the Victoria Police will find you and we'll fine you on the spot.
Will domestic flights still be allowed in as part of this? And also just your thoughts on other states closing off any Victorian visitors?
Oh, look, I can understand decisions that have been made by other states. I'll leave them to defend the decisions they've made. I've had some conversations with Gladys throughout the morning. I'll speak with her again tonight, most likely. The 10 postcodes travelling to New South Wales is not one of the 4 reasons to leave your home. So that, I think, deals with that issue from a hotspot point of view. On the health advice I have, there's no need for us to impose restrictions beyond that. And indeed, it wouldn't just be New South Wales that those families were not permitted to travel to. They would not be permitted for the purposes of food, caregiving, work. That'd be very rare if work had to be done in another state or a long way away from your home. Again, all of those decisions need to use common sense, and that key principle of only do it if you have to, that will be a feature of this lockdown, just as it was the last one. And we know that was an effective strategy, and this too will be an effective strategy if people follow those rules. I just want to make the point again, I'm not for a moment pretending that this will be easy for those families or those businesses. That is why when I make it clear to you that we will provide support, we're absolutely serious about doing that. We will provide support to protect the welfare and the well-being of any family in those 10 postcodes that are experiencing hardship. And of course, I've already gone to the immediate assistance we'll provide to businesses who have to close because of these rules. And we certainly don't rule out going further in terms of support for businesses as this second lockdown in these 10 postcodes unfolds.
Would some news posted about the flights?
Just do flights first, Jodie, and then your next, Rachel.
Just on Rich's question about flights.
Yes.
Are they only international flights? If domestic are included, what about Victorians who are on their way back to Victoria currently and whose flights will be diverted? And where also will those diversions take place?
I know the diversions are only in relation to those who would have gone into hotel quarantine. Essentially, we're saying we won't take any further hotel quarantine persons for the period of 2 weeks, and that's a function of both the announcements I've made today following that genomic testing, and secondly, I want all of our energies focused on dealing with the spike in cases and dealing with that lockdown. In some respects, it stands to reason other states are not having to do the sort of door knocking and contact tracing and mass testing that we are doing, and I'm deeply grateful for them inevitably taking those few hundred people. I think we had about 200 today. It's wildly variable. Some days it's none, other days it's a few hundred. I'm sure that they'll be able to deal with that, and I'm very grateful for them doing it. Sorry, Rachel.
We've had some new cases outside these postcodes in recent days. If those new cases increase outside these postcodes, will you shut those postcodes?
What I'd say to you is I certainly can't rule out other postcodes having to be locked down. I can't rule out further measures having to be taken, further steps having to be taken. There is a criteria, and I'll speak to this very briefly. The criteria relates to a 3-step process. The first step is to identify priority local government areas with more than twice the state case rate. Secondly, to review all the postcodes within that local government area. And thirdly, to identify priority suburbs with more than 5 cases and a rate greater than 20 per 100,000. That is the epidemiological and public health model that has been used. I would just say I wouldn't want a situation where people were unduly alarmed if they happen to live in a postcode where tomorrow morning we report there is 1 new case. But it can only take one sometimes, and you finish up with outbreaks, particularly if people go to large family gatherings when they're unwell, particularly if people, through a sense of frustration, make the judgment that they want it to be over and therefore they'll act as if it is. If the data presents against that criteria, then we will move to further restrictions in different parts of our city. That's not where we're at now, and the easiest way, the best way to avoid that is if everybody participates in those 10 postcodes fulsomely, like does as they're asked, and if people across Melbourne and indeed across Victoria continue to get tested when they're sick, continue not to go to work or school or to friends' places when they're sick, and that everyone follows the rules around the simplest of things. Hand washing, cough etiquette, keeping your distance, the list goes on and on. These lists of different measures are well understood. It is not normal that we can go back to. It's COVID normal that we all have to find, and I'm sad to say, embrace for the foreseeable future. There is no vaccine for this wildly infectious virus, and none of us can afford to act like it's over because we want it to be.
Have you considered? Have you?
What prompted you to recommend this decision? What did you hit a tipping point where you thought you needed to act?
Thanks, Andrew. Certainly, we've seen a significant increase in cases over the last couple of weeks, and it was going from those single-figure daily numbers to double figures, and then to the 40 and 70 that we've seen in the last few days. That's a significant doubling rate, and it was that trend and the fact that we had to turn it around that prompted me to take these actions. This is a heartbreaking turn in the epidemic, but these are the right public health actions, and we know that they can work. We can absolutely turn this around. We can stabilise numbers over the next few days, and we can absolutely drive numbers down, not just in those hotspot areas, but as the Premier says, if everyone's doing the right thing across Victoria, then we'll see the numbers stabilise and decrease in all those locations. But it's not just the public health directions that will have an effect here, it's what everyone does across the board, and that's why we have to really emphasise that we're in it together. But I do know that we can make a difference if we are doing the right thing.
Brett, how many cases?
That human behaviour will change?
Look, I think people have clearly been very concerned at what they've seen in the last few days. They are understandably anxious. I want to reassure them that we know what works in this space and that we can absolutely turn it around. But I think people will be newly motivated if they have maybe gone back to some old habits. They'll be newly motivated to do the right things, the things that worked in March and April and took us down to days where we had 0 cases. We can see that again if people do it, not just in these priority postcodes, but across the board.
How many of these cases can you trace back to that security breach at the hotel?
As the Premier said, it's a very significant proportion, and it might be even greater. Not all.
Is it dozens? Is it hundreds? We don't know what significant is.
Yeah, look, of those recent cases that have been analysed through late May and into mid-June, there were dozens that have been analysed. They don't represent all of the cases that we've had over that period. But they are the ones that are linking back to hotel quarantine.
And which hotel? Is it one hotel in particular?
No, you're well aware that both hotels have already had linked cases to them in terms of the staff. But I don't have the full picture because we don't have some of the most recent results, and they're a sample of all of those cases that have occurred through May, June.
Yesterday we spoke about young people flouting the rules. We've talked a lot about fatigue of lockdown. That's obviously been a consideration. How concerned are you about putting suburbs back into lockdown, that people might just give up?
Yeah, of course I'm concerned. I just have to emphasise that there is no plan B here. We have to do the things that will change the transmission, because today it'll be the priority suburbs, but if they're not turned around, it will be Metro Melbourne, and we owe it to everyone in Victoria not to have this spill across all suburbs, not to spill into rural and regional Victoria that has no community transmission, that is almost universally free of active cases. So we have to do the right thing to get back to a position where we've got very minimal and potentially ended transmission in these areas and across the board.
Premier, have you considered tougher punishments for people that are flouting the rules, and have you also considered making it mandatory for testing?
Rich, I'm glad you asked that question. Again, so many things in this are often a bit counterintuitive. Could I just put it to you? I've looked at all of that. Right, I looked at it all very, very, very deeply. There'll be much more close contact involved in a compulsory test than in someone simply refusing and closing the door. That's not the desired outcome. I don't want people to say no. I want people, when they're asked, like literally, someone standing at your door. You don't have to do much. You just say yes, and you make a massive contribution to our collective fight against this virus. I want the answer to be yes. But I would make the point, just for practical reasons, if someone, for whatever reason, decides that they don't want to be tested, we have reason to think that we'd be benefited by them getting tested, there'll be much more close contact in a forced test. There's also some other legal issues there, I think, as well. The Public Health and Wellbeing Act does allow, if someone is an unreasonable risk to public health, they can be detained. That, I think, would be less in relation to being tested and more in the past. Those provisions in the Act were drafted because of some willful conduct that had nothing to do with the pandemic. It related to some other public health matters by some well-publicised individuals at the time. They're not powers, to the best of my knowledge, that have been used since that Act was drafted. I was asked yesterday, why don't we make people, or the other day I was asked, why don't we make hotel quarantine people pay their own way? We have looked at everything across the board when it comes to all these sorts of options, particularly as it comes to powers and enforcement and trying to oblige people to do certain things. They've all been given consideration, and there's usually, if we're not doing it, there's usually a good reason for that. And the forced testing is almost certainly involves more close contact than the system we have now. And again, the best thing is if you are sick, get tested, even if your symptoms are very mild. What's more, if someone takes the time to knock on your door, because in your community there are cases and we can't track the origin of those cases, I don't think it's too much to ask for you to consent to that test. If you not going to work for the period you had to wait to get your result is an issue, we have a hardship payment for you. We will provide you that hardship payment. If there's anything else you need in the interim period, we will provide that support to you. And I would just again make the point, with the Doherty developed saliva test, that whole process, particularly for kids, for people in vulnerable cohorts, whether it be the frail-aged or people that have special needs, that is a much simpler exercise now than it's ever been.
And in terms of the potentially tougher punishment for people who ignore these stay-at-home rules?
I'll just take you back to the point I made a moment ago. I hope not to have to fine people. I hope people realise that this is very serious, and that if we don't get this under control in these given communities and beyond that, if everyone doesn't follow the rules, if everybody lets their sense of frustration get the better of them and they just act like it's over because they want it to be, and I understand that. I understand that people are desperate for this to be over. No one more than me. But it isn't. And pretending won't get us to the other side of this. We have to be realistic. We have to be looking out for each other. The biggest contribution you can make is to get tested if you're sick. The next biggest contribution, or perhaps the equally significant contribution, is to follow the rules whenever you can, wherever you can, always. To call out people in your household or your family who aren't following the rules. This is all pretty simple stuff, but it makes a massive difference. I don't want to have to be fining people. The on-the-spot fines are already significant. They have, last time we were in this place across the whole state, they did work to encourage much better behaviour and compliance with the rules, and I would anticipate that that will again occur.
Why do you think there has been such a high rate of test refusal, particularly in those hotspot areas?
Yeah, look, I think I haven't got any advice on any patterns. I've got the numbers. We'll do some more work on that and try and better understand what, if any, factors are driving that. To the extent that the nasal and throat swab nature of this, and some attendant pain in doing this, or discomfort you might say, to the extent that that's driving it, we now have, because of the good work of the great people at the Doherty, we now have a much simpler, pain-free, but also a much more logistically simple test. The person taking the test doesn't need to be head to toe with shields and masks and full PPE. They simply need to have gloves on. It is a much simpler process. The laboratory time is unchanged, but capacity is growing because of the assistance we've got from other states. But the time in actually taking the test and getting it off to the lab is really but a fraction, because there's not the need to redress every time you move from one testing one person to the next.
How practically why should Victorians believe that it will be much more effective with Corrections Victoria running?
Well, Corrections Victoria, as I foreshadowed on the weekend, are moving into that space. I think they've got the best credentials of anybody when it comes to controlling environments and dealing with people for whom their movement is limited, for whom their liberty has been taken away from them. I can't think of any better people to do that. That is a really important process. If I'm not 100% satisfied that will work, then people can be completely certain that hotel quarantine will not recommence.
Yeah, just on hotel quarantine.
Yes.
There have been some suggestions that there was inappropriate conduct by hotel quarantine workers of an intimate nature with guests staying in the hotel. Can you share any light over that?
I can't confirm that. I can't comment on that. What I would say is that there have been some breaches of well-known and well-understood infection control protocols. I did mention a couple of examples the other day about sharing various equipment, whether it be a cigarette lighter or even what might be seemingly innocent, quite low risk. It's not. As I've said, I don't know how many times I've said it now, this is wildly infectious, and one slip up can be the difference between you getting it. If you then get, if you're a bit unfortunate and you were mild symptoms, you could literally go about your business for weeks. You might never even know that you had it, but in the process, you've infected who knows how many people, particularly given if you're from a large family and your large family socialising with other large families. And then if you add on top of that, this is by way of example, I'm not quoting an actual instance, but if that sort of behaviour was then made worse and compounded by someone who, say, had tested positive but decided not to stay at home, that's when you start to see some of the challenges we are facing.
Premier, on the hotel quarantine, why was a decision taken to use security guards and not police or military like in other states? And you accept the blame for the way in which that system has panned out?
Well, we're going to have a proper inquiry into what has occurred, and I'll await the findings of that inquiry. That's the most appropriate thing to do for the next 2 weeks. As I said, I've made that request of the Prime Minister. I haven't got an answer from him yet. I think he was in a cabinet meeting and not able to provide me with that answer directly, but I'll speak with him once I leave here, and I'm pretty sure the answer will be yes.
Just going back to the genomic sequencing report
Yes.
you mentioned, have any links been established between cases over the last month or so and Cedar Meats? And will you make that genomic sequencing information public?
I'd leave that to the Chief Health Officer to answer. The only report that I've had today is in relation to links to staff not following proper procedures in hotel quarantine. I don't know of any other matters beyond that. As far as its release, there'll be a whole range of privacy issues, of course, at play, because it is literally one by one, and to make it relevant, you've got to talk about the time sequence. So you are talking about a very small number of people, but I've no advice around any other outbreak. It's simply a matter of staff doing the wrong thing, not following the infection control protocols, and then that leading to at least a significant portion of those cases, at least a significant portion, in the northern parts of our city, and that's where that has obviously contributed to the very difficult decisions that we've had to make overnight and into this morning, those that I've just announced to you.
Are you worried that even between now and tomorrow night, or even after that, people in these hotspots will go to live with friends, family elsewhere, and how will you stop that?
Well, it's a difficult balance. You can bring a snap timeline into place. I don't think that's necessarily fair. I would ask everybody in those communities to know and understand that the way you behave, the way you conduct yourselves in the next 4 weeks will be critically important to all of us. We will support you in any way that we can. This is not a decision that we wanted to make. This is not a set of circumstances that we wanted to confront, but it's here, and we have to act appropriately. There's no good trying to ignore it. There's no good failing to take the tough decisions and make the tough calls, and it is very, very difficult to have to make these decisions, but they are the best public health response. That is what will bring this back under control, and I'd urge people to follow those rules from midnight tomorrow night. But I'd also urge people right across the board, if you don't need to be going to a friend's place, then don't. Try and use common sense. You can have 5 people in your home. That's unchanged across Melbourne and regional Victoria, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to have 5 people around for breakfast, lunch and dinner. Common sense. The less people you engage with, the less chance you have of spreading this virus. That's where we're at. That is where we're going to be for many, many months to come. Unless, of course, we have some miraculous breakthrough in terms of treatment, or we have some miraculous breakthrough in relation to a vaccine. This is where we find ourselves now, and we all have to act appropriately, and we all have to understand that all of us will pay a price if we don't get this right.
Just one question, sorry. What about people who have partners in these suburbs that are now under lockdown? Last time we had sort of lots of conjecture about that. Can you visit a partner or a spouse in another suburb?
I'll let the Chief Health Officer speak to that.
I don't think that's settled as of today. We'll work that through tonight, and that'll obviously be a settled direction for midnight tomorrow night.
Does that go for relatives as well? Want to visit your sister or your,
No, I think the issue about visiting homes is exactly that, that for relatives, you really shouldn't in these priority postcodes. The 0 visitors is exactly that.
And just from the results from the suburban testing blitz, how does it compare to what you're expecting? Is it more cases than you're expecting?
I'm somewhat reassured by the stabilisation of today's numbers against yesterday's. I think the fact that we have done a blitz has genuinely identified almost all cases that are out there. There are still those that are going through an incubation period who'll develop symptoms, who'll be testing positive in coming days. So I absolutely expect more numbers. But I think the testing blitz has identified all of those infectious positive cases out there at the moment, and that's helped us to control numbers. I'm happy that we haven't got an ongoing increase, but it's absolutely a knife edge. You don't want to have numbers creeping up above 100, which is the highest we got to in the first phase of this.
How many close contacts are you monitoring now?
I don't have today's number. As you know, it was over 2,500 yesterday. We've got increased capacity, the 350 additional staff onboarding as of today. Western Australia, South Australia, ACT, New South Wales all have in situ in their home jurisdictions contact tracing staff who can just roll out as required. They can be provided with the information to do that contact tracing, and they can do it from where they are.
And should people doing door knocking, should they be wearing PPE?
No, not necessarily. If you can door knock and take a step back and keep that 1.5 metres distance, then you are safe. So that's not an absolute requirement, no.
Just to clarify, will we have an answer for couples and partners by tomorrow before midnight?
Absolutely, yeah.
Awesome. And just another question quickly, is there a concern, given we are in the midst of the school holidays, people who haven't gone on holiday by midnight tomorrow will be banned? Are you worried that people might suddenly book somewhere and rush off during the day tomorrow?
I would hope not. Again, we are emphasising that the critical aspect here is people understanding the urgency and the seriousness of this message and of doing the right thing. So I do implore people to do that, and I do think the great majority of people understand that and will do the right thing. I've got friends, I myself am holding back holidays for that very reason. I think the vast majority of people will do the same.
And just on the genomic question, genomic sequencing question I asked the Premier, have we seen any link in the last month or so's cases between those cases and cedar meats?
No, the cedar meats virus seemed to have been snuffed out in early June. There is no evidence of any original virus from February, March around currently.
And some of this, just last one, some of those 6 local government areas you mentioned before as the hotspots are outside these postcodes. Do those 6 LGA still apply? So kind of the Casey areas like that?
They're still worthy of people understanding that there's activity there. They are not under the public health directions. It is only those postcodes listed. But those were LGAs that were listed because they did, as a whole local government area, have a not insignificant number of cases. So, the message is still for all Victorians and for people in those LGAs, you have some cases around, maybe more widespread and not so concentrated in a particular postcode, so it hasn't met that threshold, but there's still transmission there.
I'll just finish by saying on the question around some of those things we'll get back to you on. This is not an absolute. This is not about limiting 100% of activity in any given community. There are still opportunities to do the things you need to do, but only the things you need to do. So in the example of whether you had siblings or other family members, if caregiving was essential and you were the only person who could enter the suburb from outside it to provide that care, well, fine. But if alternative arrangements can be made, then they need to be made. It is all about everybody sharing in this. It's not just for those who live in these postcodes, as hard as it will be for them. It is for all of us to play a part in supporting them and in making smart choices, smart decisions that don't risk spreading the virus further. On any of those matters we need to come back to you on, we will, of course. If there's no other questions, thank you very much.
Thank you.